Uh, I'm really pleased to be there and to have the opportunity, thanks to Lisa and Andreas, to share my thoughts about educating students and entrepreneurs to sustainable entrepreneurship. I think it's a great topic, and we have probably a lot of challenges to deal with in order to design and run efficient educational programs in sustainable entrepreneurship. I would like today address four main questions in relation to sustainable entrepreneurship. First, why are we talking more and more about sustainable entrepreneurship, and why it is an important topic? Second question, how can we approach education in the context of sustainable entrepreneurship? Third question is how to teach sustainable entrepreneurship and educate sustainable entrepreneurs and students in this field. I'm not sure I have a lot of relevant responses today due to the lack of research in sustainable entrepreneurship education. And finally, why I'm convinced about the relevancy in using Paulo Freire's educational model and concepts, and why I'm convinced it could be an interesting framework for sustainable entrepreneurship teaching and learning. Why sustainable entrepreneurship is an important topic to me? We are experiencing a deep world crisis, we know that, and there is actually a high level of fragility of economic, ecological, environmental, political, and demographic equilibrium. There is a clear awareness of the scarcity of key natural resources. There are also increased perceptions about injustice and inequity in our world, notably in terms of sharing natural resources and wealth. Health and climate change crises are at the source of entrepreneurial opportunities to create new organizations and reinvent new business models more in line with the current aspirations of populations in our countries. Entrepreneurship, we know that, has always been perceived as a potential response to our economic, ecological, environmental, and societal challenges. Entrepreneurship education is an educational way to help young and older people being aware of these challenges and developing knowledge, capacities, and competencies to recognize, create, value, and exploit opportunities in relation to the world crisis and the new aspirations of populations. That's why sustainable development, sustainable entrepreneurship, and sustainable entrepreneurship education take a central part in academic, scientific, and political agendas. But before going further in my presentation, what I mean more precisely by sustainable entrepreneurship. Unlike conventional entrepreneurship, which mainly focuses on economic profit maximization, sustainable entrepreneurship builds on the key premise that entrepreneurs have the potential to create economic, social, and ecological value by means of their business activity. The term sustainable entrepreneurship captures the interactive relationship between entrepreneurs and economic actors, the society and natural environment. The definition I keep at that stage of my knowledge comes from Shepherd and Patzelt, and I suppose it's a very known definition. Sustainable entrepreneurship is focused on the preservation of nature, life support, and the community in the pursuit of perceived opportunities to bring into existence future products, processes, and services for gain, where gain is broadly construed to include economic and non-economic gains to individuals, the economy, and society. That's it for the definition issue. I know that we could discuss a lot the definition I share with you. If we can move to the next slide. My second question is, how can we approach education in the context of sustainable entrepreneurship? I read and I was really interested in reading some literature from UNESCO, and I'm sharing with you the UNESCO view of education for sustainable development, education for sustainable entrepreneurship. For this international organization, education for sustainable entrepreneurship empowers learners of all genders, ages, present and future generations with knowledge, skills, values, and attitudes to take informed entrepreneurial decisions and make responsible actions for environmental integrity, economic viability, and a just society. Education for sustainable entrepreneurship could be understood, and I keep this view of UNESCO, could be understood as a lifelong learning process and an integral part of quality education. It enhances the cognitive, social, emotional, and behavioral dimensions of learning. It's an holistic process and also a transformational one. It encompasses learning content and outcomes, pedagogy, and the learning environment itself. Finally, education for sustainable entrepreneurship is recognized as a key enabler of all sustainable development goals and achieves its purpose by transforming society. I think the words transformation, transforming society and individuals are key to me and in my talk today. It also encompasses environmental education in the broader context of socio-cultural factors and the socio-political issues of poverty, equity, democracy, and quality of life. Moving to the next slide. How to teach sustainable entrepreneurship and educate sustainable entrepreneurs, educating students to sustainable entrepreneurship. It's a key question, and I think in your conference, you talk a lot, you discuss, you debate around this question. Unfortunately, I have no magic stick, and I cannot answer really the question why. You know, I'm a researcher, also a teacher and an educator, but more fundamentally a researcher. And when I did a literature review on sustainable entrepreneurship education, unfortunately, I found very, very few papers. We have little research on the pedagogy of sustainable entrepreneurship educations. And from a 2020 bibliometric study on sustainable entrepreneurship examining articles published in the period 1999 to 2019, there are no papers on sustainable entrepreneurship education amongst the 20 most cited papers. And in the list of papers that have been selected and examined in this bibliometric analysis, there are very, very few papers on sustainable entrepreneurship education. And also, I had a look in the 2017 literature review from Greco and De Jong, and there is no suggestion at the end of the paper for research avenues in relation to sustainable entrepreneurship education. So I think at that stage, at least to me, it's a big issue to have a few papers on sustainable entrepreneurship education. I know that we have a lot of practices and experiences, but research is very important to guide people in finding the best way to design courses and to implement it in their institutional context. I have also, just to end trying to answer this huge question, I have a big issue, that is education for sustainable entrepreneurship, aiming at the transformation of societies and individuals. The question is, should we integrate it into existing higher education frameworks, or should we consider it would require a transformation of the educational system itself? At least to me, education for sustainable entrepreneurship would require a deep transformation of the paradigmatic and pedagogical ways we are generally using to teach entrepreneurship and design learning environment to teach entrepreneurship. Moving to the next slide. Why Paulo Freire educational models could be an interesting framework for sustainable entrepreneurship, teaching, and learning. I'm interested in reading and getting a good understanding about Paulo Freire books and articles, I would say since a couple of years. And I found great interest in reading and trying to think about the possibility to apply in the field of entrepreneurship and of course, in the field of sustainable entrepreneurship. Before to go further and develop some ideas about the way we could use this educational model to design courses in sustainable entrepreneurship, let me introduce Paulo Freire and this conception of education. Maybe you know him and his story, but I suppose some of you don't know. Paulo Freire was born in 1921 and is dead in 1997 in Brazil. At the time of his youth, he was confronted with social injustice, exclusion, discrimination, and marginalization of part of the population in the region, Brazilian region, where he lived. He studied law, psychology, and philosophy, more particularly phenomenology. He was a teacher at Harvard and advisor for UNESCO, and he inspired a number of educational programs in Africa and South America. Perhaps you know his main books. Personally, I read Pedagogy of the Oppressed, Cultural Action for Freedom, and Education for Critical Conscientiousness. Perhaps you know that in education sciences, in other disciplines like medicine, to give you just one example, Paulo Freire is still today one of the most influential education scientists. His education model and principles are largely used in a number of medicine, but I must observe it's not really applied in the field of entrepreneurship. Even though I've read at least one paper from Karine Verduin and other colleagues using a critical approach to show in that way this kind of concept could be applied in the field of entrepreneurship. Paulo Freire and his model contribute to the emergence of a number of school of thoughts and the educational theories like critical constructivism and transformational learning theory. That's a very important contribution of Paulo Freire. The Paulo Freire's concept of education is based on the recognition in any human society of a power relationship between that he called the dominant and the dominated, the oppressor and the oppressed. That needs to be rebalanced in a movement of social transformation. The pedagogy of oppressed is the pedagogy of people engaged in a struggle for their freedom, for their autonomy, for their emancipation. This pedagogy centered, really centered on the learners, is based on the dialogue, the conscientization, and the praxis, combining from Freire's point of view, action and reflection. It's also based on problem-based learning. So we can move to the next slide that will allow me to develop a little bit more around these 4 dimensions. First is a dialectic perspective. Dialogue and ethically respectful interactions between educators and learners are at the heart of Paulo Freire's pedagogical approach. He said, the dialogue is an essential requirement because it's part of free human beings. He also said, the dialogue is anchored in a logic and a pedagogical process based on the confrontation of different points of view, which imply learners, educators, and knowledge, socially situated, and all of them co-build a new and comprehensive understanding about a problem and an existential situation. About conscientization, I think it's probably the key concept in Paulo Freire's conception of education, in his model. The conscientization is really a key education process, learning process, as I said, from Paulo Freire's point of view. It means a full awareness, allowing the learner engaged in a social practice to position herself, himself, regarding the socio-cultural reality that determines his existence, and to get a better understanding of this reality in order to have the potential possibility to act on it, and so to become an agent of social change and transformation. The process of conscientization also allows learners to discover themselves, take a step back and some distance, and finally to reflect on their existence. The conscientization is fed by the education relationship and is rooted in a dialectical pedagogy that involves experiential and theoretical knowledge while no limiting at only sharing lived experiences. Third dimension in Paulo Freire educational model is the praxis. To cite Paulo Freire himself, the act of knowing involves a dialectic movement that goes from action to reflection and from reflection upon action to a new action. As a consequence, learning is a continuous process towards the capacity development of learners to act in the real world in order to take place and transform it. It is through action, dialogue, reflection, and joint interventions of educators and learners that authentic learning, and I would add transformational learning, could be achieved. And finally, problem-based learning. You know this kind of pedagogy, probably you know it. Paulo Freire talked mainly of problem posing, not really problem-based learning. In my own reflection, I would prefer to use problem-based learning. The problem posed by the students in educational situation, or the educator, or the students and the educator, as well as the process of problematization, are at the heart of learning situations. In a problem-posing situation and problem-based learning educational model, educators and learners explore together problems, challenges, or social realities they have themselves identified. And it's really important to keep in mind they have themselves together identified, selected and assessed of a good level of relevance in order to turn them into learning situations. Educators and learners problematize the situation, analyze and discuss them based on their experiences, feelings, and knowledge. The role of educators is not to provide answers to the problem posed, to the problem examined, but it is to help the learners to apply a form of critical thinking, that is a conscientization, in relation to the selected situation. Learning can be so better achieved through critical thinking and deep analysis of experiences, beliefs, and feelings. Next slide, please. How can we apply Paulo's Freire educational model to sustainable entrepreneurship education? Thinking about my today presentation, I reflected and worked on three kinds of proposition. First, we probably need to refocus the pedagogical objectives on the personal development and the intellectual autonomy of the learners. Pedagogical objectives should be rooted in a critical perspective of teaching, learning in our higher educational institutions and should target alternatives way of emancipation. Help learners and students to be free from taken for granted ideas and assumptions circulating in the field. Because in any field, and of course in sustainable entrepreneurship, we have a lot of taken for granted ideas and assumptions. And finally, the objective should involve the learners into interactive and iterative situations of deconstructing, reconstructing sustainable entrepreneurship, creating space for invention in the classroom. All these objectives are learner-centered and aim at developing the critical mind of the learners and their capacities to learn differently in order to prepare them to become, I would say, more intelligent and aware actors in their context, facing uncertainty and complexity of the world. Second proposition, reshape. I'm not sure it's the right word, but I've not found a better word. Reshape the relationship and the quality of interaction between educators and learners. I think the interaction between learners and educators are key in the process of educating students, educating people, entrepreneurs, why not, to sustainable entrepreneurship. Educators and learners engaged in authentic learning situation and process through the dialogue are freed from any relationship of domination. It's key in Paulo's Freire theories and educational model. There is no domination of the educators towards the learners. The role of the educator is really important. She or he is not a knowledge transmitter, nor a coach or a tutor. She is a facilitator who is designing and setting up the learning situation and conditions. The educator is an awakener of conscientiousness who is playing a role of mediator vis-à-vis the context in which the learners are involved and regarding the theoretical and empirical knowledge they could use. He helps the learners to improve their reading and understanding of the world they are living in and where they should take position to act and transform it. Educators assume the role of awareness raiser and mediator and participate in making the learners aware of realities, challenges, and opportunities in their environment, and also of their capacities to orient themselves in the world and to create or identify entrepreneurial opportunities depending on their values and life aspirations. One of the key roles of the educators through their active listening, empathy, and reflective questioning abilities is to help the learners to improve their understanding of the self, notably at the level of their fundamental values, their personal and professional aspirations, and finally their capacity to achieve them. Last proposition, and we are close to the end of my talk, refine the learning situation through the problem posing, problem-based learning pedagogy. Problem-based learning pedagogy is based on 4 learning principles: constructivism learning, self-directed learning, contextualized learning, and collaborative learning. Authentic, meaningful problems raise questions and interactions, open room to dialogue, and stimulate learning. Collaborative work energizes and feeds interactions and implies the educators that facilitate the processes of learning and conscientization. The choice of problems in this kind of pedagogy must be made taking into consideration their proximity with and their meaning for the learners by making them emerge through discussion or exposition to impactful events. Problems should not be too structured or simple, as they would reduce space of dialogue and co-construction of knowledge about them. As suggested by Paulo Freire, the educator in this pedagogy must avoid to be too directive and remain in his role of mediator, as I said previously. The dialogue and contextualized learning methods privileging the imposition of meaningless ideas and knowledge. In the problem-based learning pedagogy, the learning dynamics are strongly dependent on the dialectic between learners and educators. They are also dependent on the mix of pedagogical sequences, such as individual reflection, team working, plenary discussion, and that promote the involvement of the learners in the learning process. And that's the end of my talk. I would like to conclude with a couple of words, a couple of sentences. Sustainable entrepreneurship is education, and we discussed together with Andreas. This point is at the crossroads of education, sustainable development, and entrepreneurship. Applying Paulo Freire's educational model for educating current and potential sustainable entrepreneurs, for educating students, could be seen as a transformational learning experience. Again, the word transformation to me is really key, is really important. It's also a process of deep, constructive, and meaningful learning that would go beyond simple knowledge acquisition on entrepreneurship and sustainability, and supports critical ways in which learners make meaning of their lives, acting or becoming entrepreneurs for a better and more sustainable world. This could be achieved by exposing learners to impactful events, I already said this, issues and challenges in relation to sustainability and entrepreneurship, by raising awareness on the need to critically reflect and re-evaluate the assumptions and concepts that they have about the world and themselves. As a result, through transformational experiences and the emergence of three kinds of changes in understanding of the self, revision of belief systems, and changes in lifestyle, learners align life according to new assumptions. that's the end of my talk. Thank you for your attention.